Hello. I'm going to tell you a brief story so you have some context. So I did my PhD here in philosophy. This is a wonderful experience in many ways. And PhDs are difficult because we've gone through them. But they're fun things. At some point I decided that I wanted to try to do something practical, and so I launched a nonprofit organization that we call the Maximum Project. Maximum is a term of art which means maximize the minimum. So the basic idea is to locate the most needy regions on the globe and then recommend some organizations that are doing excellent work there and allow you to fund them. So there's three things we're doing: visualizing data, recommending projects, and actually processing donations. For a variety of reasons, I decided that that wasn't a sustainable thing, largely having to do with my not having any money and nobody giving me any money to do it. I started to make money on poverty relief. Well, it actually isn't, but it's bad to make money on poverty relief. The easy ways of making money on poverty relief are bad. But recently we've talked about ways we might be able to bring that back as part of the mission of the Center for Ethics and Human Values. So I've literally been typing code up while you were clapping to get up here, where I'm going to show you what we have so far, as kind of a preview, and then tell you a little bit more about.
So is Mike in alpha?
No, it's definitely beta, alpha, in between alpha and beta. So let me just get this to work. Okay. So you can actually look at this right now on preview.maximum.org. Word of warning, it doesn't look great at all screen resolutions yet. That's a challenging thing to do. Those of you who've done any web development. Why did you go to sleep? Here's what we're trying to do. So initially, we know you're coming from the United States of America. Right now we're cheating, just assuming you're coming from the United States of America. We're going to geolocate you. So we'll say, oh, you're coming from here. This is the global average for each of these metrics that we're looking at. So this is the Human Development Index, which is a composite of life expectancy, yearly income, years of education. This is the same thing, but taking into account the inequality in that country. Here's some of the different components: life expectancy, infant mortality. We have some fun new ones on here too. We have a gender inequality index and a religious diversity index. So you can see as you look around here, it changes, so you can see how the U.S. is doing and how the global average is doing. You can also put down countries and get specific information for that. So in the future, I hope to be able to, or I plan to, diversify the visualizations a bit. Right now we're using a map. You'll notice my map is kind of quirky. If you want to know why I do it that way, I can spend a long time telling you why. But basically it's because country shapes and sizes matter, and it's hard to get that right. So I'm trying to do it right by disconnecting the continents. Yeah, it's a long video. If you're interested in knowing more, the slide that was up here a minute ago, we have a site, CEHV.osu.edu/now, which we update every time we're having an event. By the way, we'll pitch here. There's a little survey on here. If you could do that to kind of let us know how you found out about this, and that would be great. But down here at the bottom, I have a link to our CEHV page about the history, a little short history, a little video of what the Maximum Project used to be. And then down here, for you, there's a link to that preview. So play around with it, give me feedback. We'll talk more about it.
So we think this will be a terrific teaching tool. It draws data from many different data sets, and more can be added, and so we can compare different countries and a variety of different measures. It's my pleasure now to introduce the moderator of our first session, and I already mentioned him. That's Michael Neblo. Michael is an associate professor in the political science department here at Ohio State. His research focuses on political psychology and deliberative democracy, which he's going to hear me once again describe as, in my oversimplified way, study of how to make democratic institutions work the way they worked in junior high school and spent the rest of our life doing they didn't. As I said, Mike is with me the core figures in the COMPAS program and Center for Ethics and Human Values since its inception. Mike will introduce our panelists.
So Thanks, Don. Thanks to all of you for coming. And I want to make a special thank you to our two distinguished panelists today. I'm going to introduce them both up front here, and then we'll convene on the panel and go in order of the program. Jacob Hacker is the director of the Institute for Social and Policy Studies and standing Congressional Professor of Political Science at Yale University. He's also a board member of the Century Foundation Economic Policy Institute, the American Prospect, and member of the Scholar Strategy Network Steering Committee. He is the author or the co-author of many books and articles, including American Amnesia, How the War on Government Led Us to Forget What Made America Prosper, Winner-Take-All Politics, How Washington Made the Rich Richer and Turns Back the Middle Class, The Great Risk Shift, New Economic Insecurity, and the Decline of the American Dream, as well as many other books and articles, and we're very glad to have you join us here today, Jacob. Dan Haybron is a PhD in philosophy from Rutgers University. He's at the University of Colorado. Works in ethics, moral psychology, and political philosophy. He's a leading scholar studying the connection between human nature and the good life. His research focuses on the psychology of well-being and its connections with issues in ethical and political thought, as well as empirical research on well-being. They crossover that is dear to my heart. In 2015, he was awarded a very large grant from the Templeton Foundation to study happiness and well-being, integrated research across the disciplines, and has published 2 books, The Pursuit of Unhappiness, The Elusive Psychology of Well-being, from Oxford University Press, and Happiness, a very short introduction, also from Oxford University Press, as well as many influential journal articles. So thank you both for joining us. Let's convene up on the panel here. I can't remember who's first in the program. I think Jacob is? Okay, Jacob is.
I will use this little thing. My computer will not actually start. 8 hours. To finish installing software. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege to be here. I want to, since almost all the thanks have been offered already, I want to keep my thanks pretty brief, but I do want to thank Krista and Lavender, who helped make my visit possible, as well as Pierce, who invited me in the first place. And it's really exciting to be part of this program. This is a great idea, and I wish more universities would do it. And I think it's also great that this is something that's brought together different parts of the university, including the philosophical and empirical social scientific sides of OSU. But as I said, I should keep my thanks short. I'm told that I have just 15 minutes to present my work. And
Stretch that a little.
well, and I'll try to keep it to that because I really like to have a discussion. But whenever I'm in a position where I'm under time pressure, I'm reminded of an evaluation I received when I was a new assistant professor at Yale. And it began with a great promise. It said, "Professor Hacker, if I had just 15 minutes to live, I'd want to spend in your class." Because that way it would seem like an hour. So I hope that this will go by in roughly 15 minutes. I do have a couple more things to offer. As Michael said, I must be doing this wrong. Is it on? As Michael said, I've written books in recent years on American politics and how it's gone terribly wrong. That seems to be a regular theme of my work. However, I will note that this last book, American Amnesia, despite what the subtitle suggests, is actually my most optimistic yet. Which is not saying a whole lot, but is actually the case. So I do have to thank my co-author Paul Pearson, and basically all of the good ideas I had were I wouldn't say entirely his, but were formed in collaboration with him. And I want to thank another co-author who's here today, Philip Green, who's there in the back. And Philip and I have been doing a lot of work on economic insecurity that is fed into the work I've done for the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress, which has got to be the longest name for a expert group ever. So this expert group has spent the last few years producing an update to the report of the Sen-Stiglitz Commission, or sometimes known as the Sarkozy Commission. No longer do we talk about Sarkozy as much as we used to, but it was basically the major report that was put out arguing for broadening the definition of well-being and the measurement of well-being, building on the work of Sen himself. And as part of that work, we have basically been delving quite deeply into a number of topics, most notably questions about the measurement of subjective well-being, which I will completely sidestep because the true expert is here, and discussions of inequality. And my particular role has been to focus on economic insecurity and its measurement. And I will talk a little bit about that today, but actually what I want to do is sort of talk about the overall message that comes out of this work and my own about how we should understand well-being, how we should understand human progress, to put it broadly, given what we learned over the last generation about the measurement of it, and given what's happened over the last generation, particularly in the country I know best, the United States. So, an appropriate place to start this conversation is actually with a 1971 moment, and it was an exciting moment. It was not the fact of the day of my birth, which was indeed in 1971, but the time when Kuznets here won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on economic growth. And for those who don't know Kuznets' work, he was basically the person who developed the measurement of GDP in the United States, but he was honored for his work that used this measure to look at the causes of what he called modern economic growth, the takeoff in growth that he saw in the 20th century. Now, you probably also know that Kuznets believed that this growth was accompanied by an initial increase in inequality, but as we moved into high gear, inequality would fall. And that was a very sanguine view, and it made us also very willing to accept that economic growth was benign. And it wasn't necessary for us to worry too much about inequality as it took place. So Kuznets is now, I think, now that we're going to be talking about how we need to move beyond gross domestic product or gross national product, per capita income as a measure of well-being, I think it's really important to understand how valuable and important this development was. And if you go back, for example, to the Great Depression, you'll find that Roosevelt, Ford, and Hoover were reliant on incredibly crude metrics of economic output to know what was really going on in the economy. So this was a fundamental breakthrough, and Kuznets is rightly remembered as a key figure, if not the key figure, in the development of these statistics. What Kuznets saw was something that I think we tend to forget, which was just how dramatic the 20th century stands out from the rest of recent, or relatively recent, I'm going back here to the beginning of the modern period, relatively recent economic growth really was. So if you look at the United States and before it, the United Kingdom, what you see is essentially a flat line for most of human history, modern history. It's only in the late 19th, early 20th century that we really see a dramatic expansion of economic growth. And this is really striking, right? So you could see essentially no growth, the kind of Malthusian story for most of the era prior to this. And something changed in the late 19th and especially in the 20th century. Now, what changed? I think we tend to focus a lot on the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. In our own work, Paul and I have pinpointed much more the development of human capacities and the way in which government was central to that. And here I think the most obvious way in which government contributed was through educating citizens, right? You hear a lot in current parlance about the job creators. And you often, my favorite example of this is that on Labor Day, some years back, one of the key GOP leaders, Eric Cantor, tweeted on Labor Day that today is the day that we honor the job creators. And to which I think some people wanted to respond, well, yes, because everybody knows that Labor Day was set aside to honor business owners. But the truth is that if you think about what made these expansions of growth possible, it wasn't greater investments in productivity driven in significant part by education and science and technology, which also is closely linked to public investment. And these numbers come from Katz and Golden. The United States led the world in both the creation of universal high schools and then first in the creation of universal K-12 education, then high schools, and then was a world leader in college completion. It isn't anymore, despite the incredible work done by universities like this one. And that had an enormous effect. It had a very direct effect. It had also an indirect effect because this expansion of education was not just about increasing the capacities of workers, it was also about increased opportunity. And if you went back and looked at a graduating class, this is Harvard, 1912, of any major university, you would see there was a lot of diversity of facial hair, right? So the first thing I want to say is that the expansion, let us not poo-poo GDP. When it comes to the expansion of the economy, resting on investment in human capacities, this was an enormous change. And it's understandable why it gained such focus within the literature on development. In part because it was coupled with another change that occurs simultaneously and is obviously closely linked to it, namely the expansion of health. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that first, expanded health, and particularly longer lives, is worth more to individuals than the increased GDP that we see over this period. And second, that expanded health was in many ways a precondition for the growth we saw. And it too is just remarkable, right? So go back again, this time to the 1500s, look at growth in life expectancy, and what you see here is that essentially life expectancy was flat with periodic famines and plagues prior to the late 20th century and in the late 19th century. Then it takes off, with life expectancy essentially doubling, driven by declines in infant mortality. And this is too, as I said, just an enormous positive development. And it too was very much reflective of expanding state capacities, particularly the development of vaccines and cleaning up of milk and water that caused infant mortality to drop precipitously, and later the development of more sophisticated medical interventions and their expansion through public action. Why do I mention this? Well, two things. All of these developments were heavily tied up with better measures of human well-being. We began to measure things and understand things that we had previously treated as natural or beyond our control, like unemployment or poverty or poor health. And second of all, government was integral to that. It was a marriage of expertise and public authority that was really central to these things. So this is the background for thinking about human development today. And of course, the man who is coming to speak to you, Amartya Sen, is also a recipient of the Nobel Prize, and he focused on those three factors I've talked about so far: income, education, health. And one of the key things that he stressed was also the role of inequality, right? That in this question of what capacities people have to live productive lives, we had to measure correctly, and inequality was a fundamental feature of that reality. It was a very different world as the same average levels of income when income was broadly shared than when it was not. But as I said, Kuznets' story was one that suggested that inequality and growth were moving in opposite directions, or at least the inequality was not rising with rising growth. And indeed, if you look at American history, that is the story you get. This comes from the recent work of Clement Piketty and co-authors. Now, Piketty is part of our high-level expert group team. And you can see right here that this is the story in the US and in other rich democracies up until roughly the 1970s. We all know what happened after that, right? And this is the top 1% pulling away from the rest of Americans. You can see this even more graphically in this graph by looking at the bottom 50% versus the top 1%. This is a fundamental change in the reality for the vast majority of Americans. And this reality played out, to a lesser extent, in other affluent democracies. So as I said, I'm not going to focus much here on countries beyond the United States, beyond global inequality, but I want to note that this is really at the heart of much of the pushback against measures that would improve global inequality, as I'll say more about in a moment. So there's two dynamic stories to tell here that I just want to touch on. One is a story about mobility, right? What does this world look like, the world at the end of this figure, compared with the world at the beginning? It's a world in which most kids will not easily rise to a level above their parents. A child born in 1940, according to recent work by Rise Petty, had essentially a 100% chance of earning more than their parents. But with each passing decade, this chance declines, right? To the point that the most recent cohort that they follow in 1980, you can see the chance is relatively high if you're born in abject poverty, and quite low if you're born in splendor, but for most people, below 50%. And indeed, you can see this just by looking at the mean rate of absolute mobility by cohort. Now, you may be asking yourself, why has this happened? And could it be that this is mostly about growth? If you compare these two worlds, right? The two worlds, the 1940 and 1980 world, they look very different. Why do they look different? Well, one answer might be they look different because growth slowed in the 1970s. This is a GDP story. It is not, right? Because when you look at that figure there, it is not that different. That's assuming a continuation of the pre-1980 growth rate. But what if you had the pre-1980 levels of inequality? Well, then the world would look very different indeed. So indeed, the change in the chance of upward mobility, the sense of promise that is at the heart of the American dream, and the sense of despair, on the other hand, that's at the heart of the support often for candidates who say we need to make America great again, that is really embedded in rising inequality. So too, rising insecurity. So Philip and I have done this for numerous nations. I'm going to show you results for the United States. The Economic Security Index that we developed a few years back with a team of co-authors looks at a pretty simple metric. It's essentially asking if, whether from one year to the next, you see your income, your household income decline by a quarter or more. That's a lot. Most families say they couldn't get by if they experienced that kind of decline. And it means that a family making, say, $50,000 a year, right, is going to experience one quarter of that, or $12,500 decline in income from one year to the next. And we actually add in medical costs. So we say if your out-of-pocket medical costs grow, that counts as a drop in discretionary income as well. And we look to at wealth. So if you have a lot of wealth that you can buffer these shocks with, then we don't count you as insecure. Nonetheless, when you do this, you see a steady increase centered around downturns in the share of Americans who, by this definition, are insecure. And we've looked at other countries, and we've seen that levels of insecurity are quite high, particularly in some countries that have been affected most heavily by the financial crisis, but they're generally lower in other African democracies, and this upward trend that we see is not nearly as clear and not even apparent in many cases in other countries. So I want to end with a couple of thoughts about what this means for thinking about human well-being. Well, the first thought is that let us understand very clearly that the combination here of changed life expectations, the fact that many middle and lower middle class Americans know and are correct to think that they will not be able to exceed their parents in terms of their economic outcomes. And the fact that many are facing vast and growing economic insecurity, and not just insecurity of income, but of health and other valued goods, is behind an enormous amount of despair in American society today. You've probably seen the work of Angus Deaton, another Nobel laureate, and Anne Case on rising mortality among middle-aged whites. What's really striking here is just how distinctive this rise is compared with other African democracies. And this is why I think the United States actually stands out as a kind of a case study of how growth and expansion of income can be divorced from well-being. And when we talk about global inequality and think about the changes that are taking place in countries that are becoming rich, we really have to try to understand how it is and why the United States has managed, for all its strengths and its deep democratic tradition, to combine relatively good growth, relatively good economic outcomes on standard indicators like employment, with this really dark story of growing insecurity and inequality, health outcomes that are poorer than anywhere else in the advanced industrial world, Americans are, as we point out in American amnesia, actually not getting taller as quickly as citizens of other countries. I see this every time I go over to the Netherlands to see my wife's family's relatives. The average Dutch male height is around 6 feet now. The average American male height around 5'9" to 5'10". We were about 2 inches taller than the Germans we fought against in World War II. We're now about 2 inches shorter than the average German today. And no, this is not just because of immigration. In fact, this is among non-Hispanic whites. So if you look here, you see an enormous amount of despair. And why is this important? Well, it's behind the most important political change of my lifetime. The rise of I think, very deep and dangerous distrust of the state and government, and figures that prey on people's insecurities, who are also adding to that distrust. It's also behind a kind of nihilism about public policy and the ability of social and other sciences to illuminate the most important choices we face. And lest there be any confusion here, what we are debating about the measurement of economic performance and social progress is at odds with the fundamental denial of the truth that we see in so much of public policy discourse today. What was the biggest word, according to Oxford, for last year? Post-truth. And we are moving toward a post-truth world, and if we want to have relevance, if we have this valid, viable, and valuable discussion, we need to bring truth to power, and the truth that we illuminate has to be a truth that speaks directly to the lives of the citizens whose lives we hope to improve. Thank you.
First, I wanted to thank Don and Pierce for having me and everyone else who's put together this event. This is really cool. I don't know anything about what's going to, the topics of the other panels, which to me is really exciting because it all sounds highly relevant to my research. And so this is a privilege to be here. So, just to start off kind of motivating my discussion, just thinking, like, well, why should we care about promoting well-being for policy? By the way, Jacob, I agree completely with everything Jacob is talking about. So this is kind of nice. I'll be talking about a complementary set of research. So this is just, this actually is slightly dated, but I just came up with it on the plane. This is drought projections over the next century. The dark red is sort of like a Dust Bowl era. Drought levels. Just looking at the issue of climate change, and just to make it, so we're not just talking about smiley face stuff here, actually, so I'm probably going to start off depressing you. We're looking at a century in which, between issues like drought and other climate, climate instability, and also sea level rise, enough that, as far as I can tell by optimistic projections, the Netherlands is likely to be gone by the end of the century. We're going to have massive, the migration panel, I think, is going to be highly relevant because we're going to have massive relocation of populations from coastal areas. I'm not sure what to do about that, but one thing we need to, in order to deal with it, we need to really rethink our ideas about quality of life, and the way we've been pursuing happiness has been massively destructive, and we need to rethink it. And just one other example, I completely agree with everything Jacob said about the importance of GDP and other, that's been a very important development. At the same time, I think we also agree, and that was one of Jacob's points, is we can't just be counting money. So China's government, last I checked, they wanted to relocate about 300 million people from rural areas to cities, I think partly because farmers are more self-sufficient. When you move to the city, GDP is going to go up because now you have to buy your water, you have to buy everything. So and we need to know, are people going to be better off in that scenario? I'm going to skip over a lot of stuff here and come back later in the discussion. But just it's basic assumptions on the table. I'm going to assume here that well-being is one legitimate object of policy, not the only one. I think justice matters independently of well-being. Other things matter. I also think capabilities or opportunities matter. And when thinking about what's the right standard of well-being to promote, that is, so well-being is the term of art for your life going well for you. It has to do with what benefits or harms you, makes you better or worse off. And philosophers have lots of different theories about it. There's hedonists, desire satisfaction theorists, or economists call preference satisfaction, Aristotelians, objectivists. I'm going to assume that actually what a large part of my own research doesn't matter for this purpose, which is what Valerie Tiberius call pragmatic subjectivism. Whatever is the right philosophical theory of well-being, even if Aristotle was right, for policy purposes, I think norms of agent sovereignty and respect for and self-determination militate for deferring to people's own values. So what we should promote is well-being as people see it. And just to kind of clarify how this is different from other approaches to policy, I'm a pluralist. I think all this stuff matters. Resources like money, that matters. That's clearly important. I'm actually kind of hoping we can get to the point where we can stop writing papers and books with the words beyond GDP in them. But I want to especially call attention to capabilities approach, which has been very influential, and I didn't realize that Archie Sen was going to come here. It doesn't sound like I'm going to be bad on him because I think his work is brilliant. But sometimes the capabilities approach, capabilities metrics, are called metrics of well-being. There's a reason for that, I understand it, and there's no need to fight over words, but the way a huge amount of the literature uses the term well-being, and actually in much of like Sen's own work, it's really in contrast to capabilities. And what is actually distinctively important about that capabilities approach is partly that it's a contrast to a focus on well-being. And when you ask the average guy in the street here in the United States, should the government be promoting happiness? Unfortunately, people get, like, no, of course not. People like the idea of promoting opportunities or capabilities, a kind of freedom. But we should leave happiness or well-being to individuals to decide themselves. And so really the capabilities approach is about giving people freedom or opportunities and not so much directly focusing on well-being itself. I think that's hugely important, like education just for the sake of opportunity. At the same time, there's lots of ways that people's opportunities and their well-being can come apart. I've got a colleague in medical school who's studying at affluent high school in the Bay Area, San Francisco. It's not even, it's not Palo Alto where my wife is from, and where the parents have to watch the train tracks to stop their kids from jumping in front of the trains. I'm not going to do that. But my colleague says, at least until last year, it seems to have been the most distressed population on Earth that's ever been studied. 60% general depression, major depression rate, 85% generalized anxiety disorder. They have lots of opportunities, but they're miserable. So I'm just going to say, I think it's crazy to ignore outcomes. I doubt anybody in the room really thinks we should ignore how people's lives go, but it's surprising how much the discourse in policy talks as if we should. And so I think we should consider opportunities and well-being. Think of, I think for some of us anyway, a familiar parenting dilemma. You want your kids to have opportunities. So you want them to be able to go to Harvard, say. But you also want your kids to be happy and have good lives. And then you probably really don't want them to go to Harvard. I gave a talk last year on happiness at Harvard. I swear, like half the students wanted to cry. So that's all just to kind of motivate the approach, because there's a tremendous amount of skepticism still toward well-being policy. So what metrics should we use? I'm just going to assume that actually we want a plurality of measures, what's called a dashboard approach. There's no, I think, gold standard well-being measure. There's no one measure that can tell us everything we want to know. We want lots of methods, lots of measures, but realistically, attention spans are limited. And there's a reason, I think it was Kuznets who actually warned against the overuse of GDP. You know, that like once you get a number out there, people can overuse it. Well, anyway, still people, you want to pick out some headline metrics that are going to be kind of the first place you look for a rough snapshot of how people are doing. And one of the things you want from those kind of metrics is that they're consensus values, things that basically just about everyone cares about. Without a whole lot of argument, I'm just going to suggest that subjective well-being is at least one very good candidate, probably the best candidate for headline metrics. I'm not going to say these are the only headline metrics. I don't know how verbose we want our headlines to be. But subjective well-being is a blanket term used by psychologists and other social scientists for different things that we tend to call happiness. Life satisfaction, pleasure, emotional well-being. So most happiness research concerns subjective well-being. I want to say at the outset, I think there's probably more to well-being than subjective well-being. At the same time, that doesn't mean it isn't really important. Everybody cares about happiness. Even my New Yorker friends say they don't care about it sometimes, but I know they do because they're all in therapy. It's important to understand when we talk about happiness, people think we're talking about some ideal state of bliss, and so it's like basically taking rich people and making them even happier. And so this field kind of has a bad name from that end. That's really not, I think of it as like health. We don't care about health just because we want some optimal state of health. We care about it as a major domain of our lives, along with the quality of our lives being variable. And we do care about how happy or unhappy we are, and how happy or unhappy our children are. It's not the only value, but it's an important one. And I think in the way people tend to talk about in everyday life, we often use happiness as a proxy for well-being. A rough and ready way of, if you know somebody's happy, you're going to guess that they're probably doing pretty well. If they're unhappy, that they're probably doing badly. Those may be defeasible inferences, but at least it seems plausible on the face of it. I think there's, and actually I think you can endorse that from a wide range of theories of well-being. So, so let me go a little bit more into the different metrics. One type of metrics that I'm actually least interested in is experiential metrics, quality of experience, like hedonic balance. This is what hedonists are most concerned with, how pleasant or unpleasant your experience is. Philosophically, that might be all that matters. But I think, practically speaking, that and also other kinds of experience, you need to care about how meaningful your experience seems. Paul Dolan in the UK has been really focusing on that. So you might have experiences that aren't that pleasant, like dealing with your kids, yet they're meaningful and you value them for that. I think these kind of measures are more useful for time use studies, where you want to see how people are allocating their time, than for actually getting a snapshot of how people are doing on the whole. They're resource intensive, but you might want to know, like, are Americans, are we spending too much time commuting and working as opposed to doing more pleasant activities like eating and socializing? What I think is actually more useful, if you want to get a quick snapshot of how people are doing, measures that have to do with kind of general evaluations, in particular life evaluation measures, and on the other hand, emotional well-being measures. And let me say a little bit more about these. Life evaluation, the best known form of this kind of measure is life satisfaction. You ask people, more generically, so think about the things you care about in life. How is it going, basically? How is your life going relative to what you care about? Now, what's really nice about this kind of measure, and I think this is a very important type of measure, is that people don't just care about feeling good. So say if you're a suffering artist and you're glad that you're suffering through your craft, and you feel like what you're succeeding and creating really hard, you might be satisfied with your life. And that's useful to know. There's excellent reasons to measure this, and I think in practice, actually, the measures work better than you might think. They work pretty well, and I think we should use them. However, there are some problems. The most obvious problem is that these involve making a global judgment about your life as a whole. How does it all go? I rate your life on a scale of 0 to 10. I mean, it's apples and oranges. There's going to be somewhat arbitrary how you add it up. That gives room for some mischief, and you can reasonably give a range of different answers and causes one of the problems I'm going to mention in a second. There's also with life satisfaction specifically, you're basically asking people, is your life good enough? And that's kind of a weird thing. It's sort of like, well, good enough compared to what? The upshot of all that, without really getting into the details, is that there's a lot of skepticism about these measures because I think the biggest source of it is when you look at the results, they look too positive. Most people say they're happy. In the United States, and say there's life satisfaction, like 94% of people say they're happy if you ask them. Well, clearly 94% of people aren't happy or doing well. And there's lots of evidence for positivity biases, so we tend to skew positive in our answers. I don't think is a serious problem as long as we understand what the measures are telling us. What they're really useful for, I could care less if somebody says that they're happy. What I want to know is where they are on the scale, because on average, people who place themselves higher on the scale, like say life satisfaction, tend to be doing better in lots of ways, exactly as you'd expect, than people who place themselves lower on the scale. So even if everyone skews positive, what you want to know is the people who report higher life satisfaction, for instance, if you're unemployed, you're going to tend to report lower life satisfaction, things like that. It gets the results that make sense. You can think of it as like a thermometer that's basically accurate, but they got the label wrong. It always reads 10 degrees too high. That still is going to tell you that it's colder, that it's warmer today than it was yesterday, say. It's just going to give you the absolute temperature wrong. For most purposes, you don't need to know the absolute levels of well-being. What we need to know is better and worse. What's going to improve things, what's going to make things worse. So there are still issues with life satisfaction, life evaluation measures, but I think they're useful. But one way to reduce the problems is to get away from global questions. And emotional well-being measures are a way of doing that. This is going to be the least familiar concept, so I'll have to spend a minute or two on this. You can think of emotional well-being as roughly the opposite of anxiety and depression. I've argued that happiness is most usefully identified with emotional well-being, but you can use the word however you like. What really matters is the phenomenon. So just to see what we're talking about, here's a happy community called Eudonia, where a typical person is at ease, untroubled, slow to anger, quick to laugh, fulfilled, and expansive and self-assured mood, curious and attentive, alertly in good spirits, and fully home their body with relaxed, confident posture. Now, over Coral Latin speaking in Aldonia, people tend to be stressed, anxious, tense, irritable, worried, wary, distracted, and self-absorbed, uneasy, awkward, and insecure, spiritually deflated, and shaped with press. I take it to be obvious that there's a massive difference in quality of life between these societies, and if your policies are driving your society in the direction of Aldonia, and I think by the way, when you look at the subjective well-being data, you go to like rural, poor, red areas, say, the Trump voters, you can see why they're pissed. They're really not doing well by any well-being measure. So I think it's obvious that this is important. Now, how do you measure this kind of ineffable stuff? Well, luckily, we just have to be good enough for government work. We don't have to get, all the every last detail. And mental health researchers have been measuring this stuff for decades. Depression, anxiety, stress scales just are emotional well-being or happiness measures. They're just focused on a certain aspect of the spectrum. So if you want to measure emotional well-being more broadly, just adapt to those scales. And so here's an example of, this is actually something I'm working with a psychologist now, hopefully to test and validate an actual measure along these lines if he doesn't lose patience with me. So basically, this isn't just about smiley face feelings, and these questions are basically mostly adapted from depression, anxiety, and stress scans. Most of these developed by clinicians who realize that people aren't always really forthcoming about their feelings. It's not going to be perfect, nothing's perfect, but I think this sort of measure could be an improvement on what we have. Generally, these subjective well-being measures have good psychometric properties. They go up and down the right way, even if they skew positive. That's okay. You can compare populations still generally with them. I guess I'll just kind of end here. I'm going to skip kind of the last indicator, which I actually this is brand new, half-baked material, which you probably don't want to hear anyway. But basically, we may want to supplement these measures and also help validate these measures by doing self-reports of more objective life conditions. Things that everybody agrees are really important for well-being. And actually, I want to tie back to Jacob's talk, when he talked about height, how it's changed in the Netherlands. This is one of my favorite examples. Back in 96, a psychologist claimed that, oh look, the heritability of happiness is so high. One thing they didn't understand heritability, which was odd, but anyway, it's so high that trying to be happier maybe as futile as trying to be tolerant. Now, if you've ever known somebody who had a bad or a good job, or a good or a bad relationship, or couldn't pay the bills, and was going to get evicted, you know that things can make a big difference in how happy you are. That was just nonsense. And for comparison, you might think height. Well, it actually isn't futile trying to be taller in this sense. People in the Netherlands, males, are on average 8 inches taller than they were 150 years ago. That's a result of things like good policy, increasing GDP, and things like that. So one thing you could do is measure, I guess I'm not saying this, is find some consensus items that everybody would agree. If your well-being measures aren't tracking these things, then there must be something wrong. And I think at least relationships, the quality of work, and a sense of security, like economic security. People's answers to these questions, your measures of well-being ought to correlate pretty well with these. A nice thing about this also is it's a little more objective. It's probably less susceptible to cultural differences in reporting. So, you know, do you have confidants you can talk to about stuff? Are you treated with respect? Things like that. Work, are you engaged in, on a daily basis in things you find worthwhile? Do you want paid work that can't get it? Things like that. And that itself could be a useful well-being measure to supplement the subjective well-being measures. So I'll just leave on that, just sort of summarizing that, you know, essentially we want well-being metrics to play a major role in policy, and subjective well-being measures are at least one good candidate for identifying measures. I don't think there are other ones that are important. Maybe we want mnemonic measures. We certainly want measures like education and things like that. But we want things including life satisfaction type measures, emotional well-being measures. I think also hedonic measures, measures of experience, and maybe also this kind of consensus predictors of well-being. That's a new thing that I'm not sure if that is either novel or is useful, but it's a thought. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, great. Thanks to both of you. I think that those are two terrific presentations. Part of my job is to draw them together a little bit and get the conversation rolling. I'm really just going to pose two questions, one more or less directed at each of the panelists, though either is certainly welcome and encouraged to reply to both. And then I'm going to open it up for general question and answer. So the first question I direct to Jacob, because I think it follows right off of one of the last things that Anne was talking about. In addition, so in political science, there's been a lot of talk. There's entire research agenda on post-materialist values. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts about post-materialist values, whether that it's a kind of live, let them, cake attitude in the face of fundamental insecurity, or whether it made a certain amount of sense when that literature was emerging in the 1970s when we had much less inequality, and maybe looked like we were extrapolating out to growth and inequality that might have promoted post-materialist values versus the roughly in the 1980s, the discontinuity in that. And it seems to me that links in a little bit to what Hannah's talking about in terms of relationships, leisure work, meaningful work, things along those lines, rather than income, education, health, inequality as objective measures.
Yeah. You want me to take that first?
Yeah, why don't you take it first?
So I'll try to keep it really short because I'm really looking forward to the broad conversation. And it is something I've puzzled over a bit myself because I truly believe that the post-materialist argument that essentially when countries reach a certain level of affluence, quality of life concerns, environmentalism, questions of identity come more to the fore. The idea being, I think, quite reasonably that when people are worried, first and foremost about whom they're going to eat, they have a lot less time to be concerned about these things. But I think it's a mistake to see this as displacing some of the material concerns, and in fact, for a variety of reasons I discussed, I think those concerns have become more manifest. And I think one way to think about this is about well, two things. One, I really like Dan's discussion about security, and I didn't get a chance to say that part of the agenda that Philip and I are pursuing and that others are working on is how to measure perceived security, right? And one of the things about economic security is that it really is hard to think of it as just a measured phenomenon, like how likely it is that you're going to face a very large income loss. When we talk about economic security, we often will say things like, I feel, someone feels insecure. And so what's the relationship between those feelings of insecurity and the objective experience of job loss, health insurance, lack of health insurance, and so on? That's a really important research agenda, and I see it pushing in the direction when you start to look at it as being a much closer relationship than you might think about the objective experiences of people and their perceptions of insecurity. People actually have a much better idea about the economic risks that they face than they do some of the health and safety risks. We have this large literature that says people really can't think about risk. Turns out people who are face greater risk of unemployment, Philip has shown, believe that they face greater risk of unemployment. Phil may no longer be a background gesturing for an empty chair. But why do I mention that? Because it is similar in some ways to the debate about the relationship between subjective well-being and objective economic circumstances, right? That debate has gone through a series of phases, starting with the equation of GDP per capita and welfare, to an argument that was almost arguing that they were fundamentally different, that beyond some level, basic level, you entered a world in which there was little relationship, which sounds kind of post-materialist in a way, to a reevaluation of that data suggesting that there's a strong but not absolute relationship, and that people who are unemployed actually have lower subjective well-being, or people who struggle to make ends meet have lower subjective well-being. So this is, I think, to me, really points to this important question of, well, to what extent, how do these relationships, what are these relationships in material and perceptual experience of one's economic and other aspects of their life, and what are some of the ways in which public policy and different countries' social structures affect it? And so I actually really love this temperature gauge kind of way of thinking about it. I think Dan rightly did not go into the difficulties that arise, not when you're comparing a single country over time, but when you're thinking about whether the dial is the same, the temperature scale is the same across countries. But if you, for a moment, just suspend disbelief and say, well, we might be measuring the same thing across countries, I'm very struck that the cross-national literature says, yeah, there's a pretty strong relationship between income per capita, or particularly median income per capita, not because of inequality, and well-being, and individual income within countries, and measures of subjective well-being, but things like security, which is often linked up with an effective welfare state, social trust, and relationships are also really important as well. And so I end just by saying that there is a fear, I think, in the literature or in the discussion of happiness that you're going to have all these governments that it's sort of like the solution in a cash-strapped world to achieving ends you want. It's really hard to give people benefits because we got no money, but hey, we can make them happy, right? We can all send them like smiley face text or something. You know, this is sort of the parody of the British efforts to improve happiness. And I just want to say that what all the literature is suggesting to us is the relationship is strong between things that we typically thought would improve people's material well-being and their happiness, but not absolute. And there are a lot of things that fall into the post-materialist category that matter enormously to people that wouldn't necessarily be picked up in terms of their GDP, including such things as their relationships, the quality of environment around them, and so on. So to me, this is a question that really ties back to this sort of fundamental relationship between what we're talking about, the role of perceptions, and economic security, and ultimately why we should care about subjective well-being and policy making.
What Jacob said, that was great. And yeah, so there was a while in which a lot of the happiness folks are, oh, money doesn't matter, or and it's. I think now we've moved past that, and it's clear that material metrics matter and are important. It does make a difference what kind of measure you're looking at. So, like emotional well-being measures seem to track income-related variables more weakly than life satisfaction, life evaluation measures. It's not clear exactly what's going on there. I think that happens for both good and bad reasons. But also, there's a tendency kind of all around, I think, for a lot of people to oversimplify the relationship between material conditions and well-being. I just came back from Panama, and by the way, if I don't shake your hand, it's because I brought back the Andromeda strain or something. It's not that bad, but, and there's some poor areas where, quality of life is not good at all. And then stay by an indigenous village where some of the guys are like, I can afford rice and beans, what more do I want? They've seen rich people, they've been off the island and into, and seen, basically nobody leaves that village except if they just really lack opportunity or something. Like nobody voluntarily relocates from that unless they basically have to, or at least that's what I was told. A lot of what happened is, one way of thinking about it is the cost of happiness in a sense. Like how much the relationship between money and well-being itself is determined by social conditions. In my neighborhood, money is really important for well-being. Housing is really expensive. It just, you need a car to get around. I care, I'd really like a raise. Unfortunately, I don't think anybody relevant is listening, but, on the other hand, there's a famous curve in a Kahneman and Deaton study of the U.S. looking at Gallup data showing for life satisfaction, when you're looking, basically, I won't get into the technical stuff, but basically life satisfaction keeps increasing with income without any obvious limit. Whereas, so the more money you have, the higher on average your life satisfaction will be. What the causal relationship is another story. But with the emotional well-being measures, there seems to be a plateau around $75,000. So above that, it just kind of flatlines. But actually not published yet as far as I know, but I'm told that now they have enough data points for people above $150,000 income, it actually starts declining above that point. So it looks like maybe in one sense, on one of the measures, richer people might get actually less happy in this country. So, but anyway, like then people say, oh, well then what everybody needs is $75,000. Look at people in Mexico don't have $75,000 there. Well, that's indexed to the standard cost of living in the United States and the way we live and our social conditions. And it varies greatly within the US too. The number's higher in New York City. And actually, there's some evidence, like in Mexico, that it flatlines around 4,000 in household income. So it's tricky, it's complicated, and so in general, richer countries are happier, but there's exceptions, and the strength of the relationship varies a lot.
Great. Thank you both for that. So this question is primarily for them, but I'd be interested in what Jake has to say as well. And I'm not sure if I can formulate this quite as crisply. So we start out with sort of GDP, economic well-being, and then there's kind of a philosophical anthropology, capabilities approach, notions of what makes for a good life. And then we jump to individual subjective well-being. And it seems to me that there's a big, I'm a political scientist, there's a big stratum that's missing, which is politics. And when I say politics, not necessarily politics in the how do we get from here to there, but politics in the sense of collectively deciding what the good life looks like within a given ethical political community. I was struck with Dan, you only seem to want to deal with consensus values, really consensus values, like people shouldn't suffer. Stuff along those lines. And I guess I was interested, and to some extent I actually think, I noticed even in Jacobs, so my worry is that there's a kind of technocratic aspect to this, where people are left out of defining, I mean, in one sense, if we're just talking about subjective well-being, they're involved. But there's no collective sense of being able to think through, and for purposes of policy, that struck me as strange. And just wanted to know with each of you, is it a difficulty with the street lamp? Meaning that it's really hard to figure out what what the political notions and self-definitions would be for well-being, and so they're hard to measure, which is perfectly reasonable. Or is it a more philosophical justification, or you just put it on the dashboard?
So before I personally am not very interested in this positive psychology stuff about how you can be happier, counting your blessings and stuff like that. Not that it isn't worthwhile or whatever. To me, the most interesting action is at the policy and societal level. If it had to be pinned down and say, what's the secret of happiness? Support better policies. That's way oversimplified, but I think what got me into this line of work was basically shuttling between two different communities and finding how different my own well-being and actually personality was between the environments. We're extremely sensitive to the environment we're in. Our preferences are shaped by, I think actually a big part of policy is shaping the preference architecture we live in. What Americans count as a good diet today is partly shaped by agricultural subsidies and things like that. What we think is a good meal is different, and it has to do with policy decisions that were made. They're not just standalone. There's a really good question about the diversity. The sort of one size fits all, the headline measures. I think it's essential, and I think it's essential that the policy be tailored to the population. It needs to, maybe the most important thing that we need to do in policy is just listen to people. And that's like this village I was in, the indigenous village. I mean, everybody, people came in and said, oh, let's build you toilets. I'm like, we don't need toilets. We'd rather have a lawnmower for the baseball fields. Or just beer. So I think the metrics that you want to use are going to vary from one population to another. This is really very crude, like kind of the first place you look, just compare like New York with Louisiana. The cultures tend to kind of differ there. emotional well-being may be more important in one place than in another, and or for that matter in Confucian cultures where emotional well-being may be less important than other values. And so different metrics and weightings are going to be appropriate, I think, for different locales.
I'll just say a few quick things. So one is just in terms of method, right? So the ways in which we measure. And I do think it's fair to say that in psychology and economics, which are the two biggest disciplines that influence this literature, there is a very strong tendency to focus on individual level variables. Now, it's possible to think about a lot of these things about the character of communities and democracies as at the individual level, how they affect people, but they tend to get often put to the side simply because they're not obviously measurable or manipulable at the individual level. But I agree with Dan Space's view, which is that the level at which that we should be thinking often is the level at which what are the kinds of collective policies that could have the biggest effect. The other thing I would say is that it raises this difficult question, or it could be a difficult question depending on what the data shows, about whether we value democracy and citizen participation as an independent end in itself, or whether or not it's instrumentally producing this improved well-being. And I'll just say that the case that Robert Dahl and others have made for democracy is a pretty simple one, right? It's that people are the best judge of what's in their own interest. And there are a lot of political scientists, most notably in recent years, Larry Bartels and Chris Aiken have just written a book entitled Democracy for Realists that raised questions about the extent to which that really is true. I'm still struck by how, over the longer term, there is just a lot of evidence that, that on average, systems of governance that are responsive to popular preferences and help people deliberate about those preferences produce better outcomes. There is one key finding is that of Sen, that dying from people in democracies don't die from mass famines. That's a pretty big influence on subjective well-being. Another is the fact that while China has been praised for years as being this massive well-being generator because of the economic growth that's resulted, you see a lot of signs, right, that there are aspects of well-being that are being sacrificed because of a lack of engagement with the experiences of citizens within the country, most notably the destruction of the urban environment. So that's just, to me, a really fundamental question we should have. I basically think democracy is the best form of government, except for all the others, regardless of whether it's instrumentally, not regardless of, but even if it's not always instrumentally good. I mean, surely democracy is a hassle sometimes, and the specter of it can be quite dispiriting at times. But I think actually, in practice, over the long term, on average, it's actually pretty good at promoting well-being too.
Great. Okay, that's all I'm going to do. I'm open it up to the floor. Yes. And we've got microphones.
Thanks for those excellent presentations. Dan, I have a question for you. I'm assuming your research is focused on rich countries, correct? Middle income as well?
Not any countries in particular. I think those are probably better understood. But.
Okay, so then applying this objective well-being measures approach to developing world context, then how does the adaptive preference challenge? How do you meet that? The literature in development ethics, particularly feminist development ethics, on adaptive preferences. So, women in subordinated contexts, scaling down their preferences, settling for less, and then conceivably reporting happiness that is adjusted to constrained circumstances and subordination. How do you deal with that challenge?
So that is a real issue. I think it's actually, in the field, in practice, it's, so this is actually one of my worries about the global life evaluation measures, is if you just say, well, how's it going on the whole? It's much easier, basically you just say, well, I could get away with saying my life is good, Well, you should be grateful for your blessing. The slide, so just the slide that I skipped over, one of them, in a study of poor areas like in the slums of Cairo in Egypt, they asked people, actually, this rarely happens, who said they were satisfied with their lives. Why are you satisfied with your life? And in general, they didn't say, because my life is great. What they said is, they're perfectly aware that the situation wasn't great. They'd say things like, one day is good, the other is bad, whoever accepts the least lives. Or we must praise God, we can't do anything, we're helpless. And so, what when you actually, when you probe a little deeper and get a richer subjective data set, what you find is that there's, the life satisfaction is actually more resignation. They're not saying their lives are great. They're saying life is actually a kick in the teeth, but it's good enough. That's one of the reasons I'm not crazy about where I have worries about the life satisfaction measure. In general, though, you really do find the poorer the populations are, the worse the deprivation. People do significantly worse on the subjective well-being measures, and I think on the emotional well-being measures especially. Like the women, I actually don't know specifically that data. I'd be very curious because that is the sort of thing that like Nussbaum and Sen focus on especially. I would expect the emotional well-being data would be pretty negative in those populations. I could be wrong though, and this is where I also think at a certain level, in St. Louis where I live, the African American population in the city, racially, it's not a great place, right? There's a lot of racial injustice. There's information that's not showing up in the subjective well-being measures, and so that can only be one part of the picture. Racial injustice is not cool, whether it makes people unhappy or not.
Before I call on the next person, I just realized that I introduced Janice from the University of Colorado. I apologize that. St. Louis University. Just bounce back in that. Yes, other questions?
Yeah, just as a quick footnote, I've had a lot of those. It looks like the case data is wrong. I'll send it.
I've looked at some of the critiques, I don't agree yet.
Oh, yeah.
So the main concern has been about the additional work they've done breaking down the educational groups. However, I assure you that the U.S. is if you look at just middle-aged whites as a whole, relative to populations in other countries, the crucial point in that slide is not that there's this rise, because you can make that rise go away with various kinds of manipulation. It's that every other country has seen continuing declines in mortality, and the U.S. hasn't. That divergence is very, very, very robust. And that's really the way we should think about a lot of these things, right? What are our expectations, right? It's certainly great that people, if we push the data enough that we can get it so that people are not dying at higher rates, but every other country and ethnic group within the United States has seen continuing decline. So I would be very surprised if that core finding. Their problem was they wrote this piece that was peer-reviewed and published in 2015, and then they wrote this working paper that included a lot of educational breakdowns, and it was just like red meat for the statisticians. Like Gelman has come after this stuff, Gelman of Columbia, and his big point is that there's a lot of heterogeneity within white middle-aged people, which is like no doubt, right? There's a huge amount of heterogeneity. And that's why it actually makes sense to just lump it together, right? So it's not an argument about like this small subgroup. It's just like, look, white America, which is a big, big chunk of people in the world, is seeing this flattening or rise in mortality rates. The rest of the world, no one argues with this. It's seeing continuing declining mortality. Blacks, no one argues with this. It's seeing declining mortality. Hispanics, no one argues with this. It's seeing declining mortality. So I'm not willing to go to the map on every claim, but that, I saw that in the data before they found that, not that I was doing anything special. There was a bunch of reports that had been done on mortality trends. It was already clear the U.S. was an outlier going from kind of the top to the bottom of the ranks. Their innovation was to really pinpoint that it was white Americans and white middle-aged Americans that were where that was happening. Sorry.
Did you see the Scottish researchers' analysis?
Oh, okay.
No, I'll send it.
Great.
I'll send it. Okay, but my real question is, how do we know what's cause and what's effect?
With regard to D,
No, I'm sorry, with these models you're talking about.
so I just say I'm not the person probably to be the big causal, the word that I sometimes use, the causal Nazi, that may be strong. That there's this book by Jonathan Safran, which is really great, called Everything is Illuminated. I just say everything's in doctrines. So I'm not so interested in what's driving what, and I'm really interested in kind of what's the complex conditions. That said, so this gets to this earlier question about adaptive preferences. So one of the kinds in which you can say something that's a little stronger about causality is when you see real big changes in people's state. Now, it's of course the case that the kind of people who lose their jobs are different from the kind of people who don't lose their jobs. So you shouldn't be using people who don't lose their jobs. But you can look at people who had jobs and then don't have jobs and think about their state of well-being across those two realities. And this is one area where, so there's all this work by Danny Gilbert and others suggesting, oh, we think things are going to be bad. It's not so bad to lose your leg, and it's not so bad to lose your job. People kind of get back to their baseline level packages. I think that's really proved to be wrong. I don't know about legs, but I know about jobs. If you lose your job or if you have a fundamental shock to your life expectations, it's pretty bad. It's not as bad as we may presume ex ante, but it's pretty bad. And we're pretty sure, since we can see two states in the world, that that's because you lost your job. So I would say, in general, the causal questions are like, is subjective well-being causing this, or is this causing subjective well-being? Is insecurity a result of material circumstances directly, or is it somehow caused by a set of factors that are associated with those material circumstances? I'm not as interested in those questions in general, because I think that these are generally things that go together, and our task as analysts who are trying to inform policy is really to try to identify, okay, what are the constellation of conditions that are associated with better well-being. I do grant, though, that it makes a difference if you move one policy lever versus another, if the one policy lever is more likely to cause the outcome you want than the other. But I do think that a lot of this literature gets hung up on causality. To say that, I will now be excommunicated from the Yale political science.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think it's for Dan, but I welcome your conversation. So, I'm interested in this idea that justice might be a different value that we have to think alongside well-being understood as a subjective assessment of well-being. And I appreciated the reference to the Black Lives Matter movement. We could add to that the sanctuary movement that, as I understand it, is trying to change our conversation about what we take security to look like. So rather than security being something like everybody leaving each other alone or getting out of everybody sort of not being in the way of other people, they're trying to convince us that security is really about being connected to people in a particular kind of way. And if we find that we take on that new conception of security and then we look around and see how disconnected we are from other people, we might think that our subjective assessment of well-being goes down, but maybe the conditions of justice or the conditions that are suitable for justice go up. And so I know that you didn't speak specifically to this, but it seems to me like from a policy perspective, I might want to ignore or really downplay subjective assessments and look more towards the conditions of justice if I was trying to create conditions or policies that would lead to overall justice outcomes. So yeah, so I guess my question is, when you're putting these two things together, justice understood, I'm not concerned now, but justice understood somehow and well-being understood on a subjective level, and you're not worried about being reelected. How do you do that?
So I guess I'm sort of rabidly pluralist. So, and there's a tendency on the one hand, people say, look, it's all about promoting well-being. I'm actually on some well-being panel where our slogan is apparently, the goal of government is to maximize well-being. And like, yeah, right, okay, anyway. But
the argument is that, we should stop talking about changing our conception of security because it's making people unhappy. So if you only think about well-being and you think about well-being in the way of calculating well-being, places a high, rate on subjective assessment, that's my word.
I think this is another reason why I really like the idea of something like the consensus predictors, which ask questions that are less about, they're subjective in a sense, but it's like, do you have enough money to pay the bills? It's stuff that's likely to be a little more grounded in reality and less subject to adaptation processes and rethinking. But also emotional well-being measures, like mental health measures, those are a lot harder to gain through just sort of rethinking things. Just think of how hard it is for people to think their way out of depression. And whereas life satisfaction, there are real worries about, I've spent years bashing life satisfaction measures, and then the more I look at how they perform, like Jacob talked about the world rankings, like in the World Happiness Report, you look at the countries at the top of the rankings and at the bottom of the rankings, and it's like, there's a reason why they're there. Like, it's really remarkable how well they perform. That said, there's still maybe one reason life satisfaction has as strong a relationship as it does with income in our country might be that we live in a consumer society that makes material concerns constantly salient. And so you're not really thinking so much about the fact that you've got a loving family, because that's not foreground in your mind. And so relationships get less importance. When you look at emotional well-being measures, it's one of the things I like about it. What got me onto that was they're more strongly correlated with things like doing what you did best yesterday. Are you treated with respect? Do you have people you can count on, relationships? So it looks like the emotional well-being measures more closely track that, and I think they're harder for people to gain through just rethinking. But just one more example to illustrate it. There's Wolfers and Stevenson, Wolfers did a study, the paradox of declining female happiness. It looks like as women's rights have improved in the United States, their subjective well-being has declined. That's one of my favorite examples because it illustrates both. It can't be just about subjective well-being. You need to, I think just the justice question itself, there's unquestionably a good thing that happened in recent decades for women. On the other hand, I think it's also unquestionably important if, in fact, women's experience has gotten, if women are less happy, and the most plausible explanation is women are doing all this stuff that they used to do, and now they're also doing paid work outside the home more than they used to. So it's like, it wouldn't be surprising if subjective well-being had gone down given what's happened. I think those are both important facts, and so the subjective well-being information is important, but it should not be dispositive.
There's a lot of hands. Keep giving me eye contact. I promise you're in my head, but
I have actually another justice question. Concerning perceptions of tolerance for suffering and perceptions of well-being, I think you could argue that how much tolerance a population might have for a certain condition is correlated somehow to their perceptions of the justice of that situation or other kinds of factors. So a quick example, I do my work in the former Soviet Union, and I've done some oral histories of some old elderly people who lived through the Second World War and were undergoing post-socialist transition in the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this was during the 1990s. They were talking about the hardships of the Second World War, very hard things, objectively, with list all the deprivations and so forth, and sacrificing the for the front. But it was all worth it. They were fighting the fascists. They had a purpose. And then you notice the Soviet Union, what a great meaning that was the great patriotic war, as it's called. It's still celebrated to this day. Whereas the sufferings of the 1990s, with hyperinflation, loss of jobs, and subjectively maybe, I didn't measure them generally, but they appear to be the same for 1990s versus 1940s. But there's no sense this is going anywhere, that the promises for the West about you democratize and marketize things will be great, that was not obtained for them. So that sense of purpose or the meta-narrative is missing. So it seems to me that that somehow belongs in that, and I'm not sure how that would. So maybe that's more question to you, Dan, but to Jacob, since you've written so much about inequality, then how does one measure sort of states of justice in society? When are arrangements tolerable, when they're it's the best we can do, at least it's fair in some way. That's not because the government official was for this. Thank you.
Well, I'll answer that really quickly. I mean, it's hard, and you have to decide what your focus is. So if the question is, okay, is inequality in society, as an empirical social scientist, I ask, is inequality in society justified? I can't actually. That's a hard question for me to answer. I can say, is it reflective of some of the forces that often get attributed to? Like, is it primarily a result of the degree to which globalization has created a greater reward for skills, right? Which seems to suggest that it's kind of a natural occurrence, and indeed, perhaps even one that follows merit. And that's the whole winner-take-all politics, basically an argument against that. And saying it's not a natural outcome, but a result of public policies, both the government's done and not done, and those policies in turn reflect disproportionate political power of those who benefit from these policies, right? So to me, that's a very strong, that makes a strong case for A, that we need policies to change, and B, that we need political reform, but it's not so much about the justice and inequality as such. But I think it speaks to that question. So I'm not a philosopher, so I'm not working in the justice realm so much. That said, there's also this question of, well, what do people think or perceive, right? And I think this is one that people have really grappled with. So it's pretty clear that inequality makes people feel bad, right? The question that they often ask is it about a sense of unfairness? It's a justified sense of unfairness, but again, we'll get back to justified. Or is it envy, right? Which is not considered a very worthy reason to feel bad about inequality. I'm reminded, since you brought up the Soviet Union, of an old Soviet joke. There was an American, a Frenchman, a Russian. They always start this way. And they interrupt the genie and they get a wish. The American says, I want a ranch in Jackson-Hole. The Frenchman says, I want a chateau in the Riviera. The Russian thinks for a long time and says, I don't have a goat. My neighbor has a goat. Kill my neighbor's goat, right? So is it kill my neighbor's goat kind of thinking, or is it more that there is the real reason that we should recognize, right? And I think these are just difficult questions. My general feeling, though, is that we should give some privilege to people's natural reactions. We know that people are highly loss averse, and that's hardwired into us, so that's part of the reason insecurity is so profound, and such a profound emotion. And we know they're inequality averse, that in settings from games to deliberative ones, right, they have notions of fairness that are embedded in their understanding of the social situation. And while we shouldn't recognize all things that are natural or embedded in people's psychology as necessarily good, these seem to me to be a basis. They reflect our development as social creatures, and in that respect, they are part of the reason why we have cooperative and mutually beneficial societies and therefore deserve our respect. All of which is to say, I can't answer your justice question, but I thought a lot about it.
I think very briefly, if that's possible, I think measures of meaning or a sense of purpose are important. There's the experiential type of measure that I mentioned there. It almost made, it almost made the presentation. I don't think we have those measures nailed down as well, though, and it's, I think, inherently very difficult because I know a lot of people whose, lives are very meaningful, and experience their lives as meaningful, but they don't conceptualize it that way. So if you ask them, they'll be like, what are you talking about? So it's very hard to measure, and that's a phenomenon that you're getting at that I think is important. We can't get. Well, I mean, not
time
with
for
what I do.
one more brief question if we can.
Thank you. So this is a question for Dan primarily. As you know, Dan, there's a lot of controversy in philosophy about what the correct theory of well-being is. You can imagine one measure of well-being that is a really excellent measure of well-being according to one theory of well-being, but is a terrible measure of well-being according to all the other theories. You can also imagine a different measure of well-being that is a nearly pretty good measure of well-being according to all the plausible theories of well-being, but not a terrific measure of well-being according to any one of them. Right? I'm thinking, given that there's no consensus, given that we're not going to resolve the question of what the correct theory of well-being is, we should be looking for measures of the second kind, measures that do pretty well, if not excellently, on any plausible theory of well-being, instead of going for measures that are whose theoretical presuppositions are more controversial. So, can you tell me what are the best candidates among the measures of well-being that you're familiar with for being sort of decently acceptable measure on any plausible theory of well-being?
So, actually, I take the subjective well-being measures to be the best candidate there. Now, there's also more specific things like education, health, that I just didn't feel the need to get into, and I'm more interested in more general indicators. Because I think even Stoics who think you could be happy on the rack and, think of pain as an indifferent. But they still, if you're really unhappy, if you're depressed, they consider that being low in well-being for different reasons than hedonists. But so I think very broadly, subjective well-being is going to be important. I mean, for Aristotelians, Aristotle thought the virtuous life, the good life, is also the most pleasant life. And so, like everybody, I think, seems to care at one level or another about subjective well-being. How much weight to give it is another very good question, though. So again, there's going to be more kind of achievement-oriented cultures where I think the emotional well-being metrics are going to deserve less importance, and measures of things related to achievement, say, or and I also think, given the plurality of any population, we want a diversity of measures, not just these, but also like eudaimonic measures. There are going to be people who are Aristotelians in the population, whether they realize it or not, and you want to track the kind of things that they care about. A lot of people value achievement, doing something worthwhile, more than they value being happy. And for those people, policy ought to take account of that.
I hope you all join me in thanking our panelists one last time.